Hello, everyone. My name is Brian Nettles, and last week we had the good fortune of meeting with Sherry Cardinal on a Zoom call. The interview took over an hour, but we're only going to show the first 20 minutes or so today. And I just like to say I was very impressed with her. She just has a very sweet demeanor about her, and she is just anxiously engaged going about doing good works, and I like that about her. Now, one of the things I thought was fascinating was how she used family history to uncover not only her family history, but she was able to use that to tie relationships with other people together, particularly David Taylor. It was family history research that brought her and David together, and they do a lot together now, and she's a great friend to him. So Sherry, why don't you just you give us a background as who you are? Where did you grow up? What is your relationship to the tribe? How did you? What is your whole background? Give us your story.
Well, it's another interesting one. Um, my birth is suspect. I mean, obviously I was born, but how I was born and where I was born is still somewhat of a mystery, although I've been able to trace it. My father was a Bouvier, French Canadian indigenous person from Canada. My mother was a high school girl in Massachusetts. And as we know, in the 40s, 30s, um, a lot of the French Canadian indigenous people moved down through New England to work in the factories when the farms played out and the fur trade played out in Canada. And um, come to find out that the attending physician at my birth was a doctor from Manitoulin Island, Canada. Hence the French connection, the Canadian connection. And my birth took place in Massachusetts because that's where my mother resided. How my mother and father got together is a bit of a mystery still. We're not sure of that relationship. I do know that my mother was high school, a high school girl. She was 17 when I was conceived, uh, just turned 18 when I was born. Um, I was whisked away and she was not allowed to keep me. Um,
By whom?
that's a good story. I'm not, I'm sure you're familiar with the 60 scoops, the 50-60 scoops, where children, indigenous children or part indigenous children were taken away from their families and sent to live with European parents. Well, that happens to be my story. Um, how all that transpired is still a mystery, although I do have a half brother who's still living from my Bouvier side, who was raised by our father. So he's filled me in on some of it and what he knew because he was a child at the time as well. I was adopted
So,
by a, go
so
ahead.
was your father and your mother were they both Native American indigenous?
My mother has indigenous in her as well. She is mainly European, but there was some intermarriage with the Nipmucs in Massachusetts.
Okay.
Nipmuks, Nipmucs. Um, they were part of our relationship. Mom remembers them in the home and all of that, but she was a young girl. So, and unfortunately, my mother died in 2004 after I met her, my birth mother. And so some of that is lost to posterity um, in further digging, other than the lineages. Interestingly enough, because I do genealogy, it was my attempt to find people. That's how I found my birth mother through doing genealogy and DNA. Um, my mother's family goes back to the Mayflower at least three times that I've found. So I have this strange connection over here with the British and then my French family in Canada, and then the indigenous from Turtle Island. And so I fight all three of these things at one time. I mean, I have all three of the main migrations of Turtle Island in my um, lineages.
So what's your father's connection? Your birth father's connection? He's
He was
indigenous also?
he's the one that was French Canadian and indigenous. He
Okay.
was Métis, to use the word that's more common.
Okay.
And his family history was working for Hudson's Bay and the Northwest Company doing fur trade. Um,
Yeah.
they intermarried with the indigenous, which is how I get related to Mitika. We're cousins to a degree, by blood, and by relationship, we're mother and son.
Okay. And then you
So
were
that,
adopted into a new family after your birth.
yes, a Swedish family, a half Swede. My mother was birth or adoptive mother was born and raised in Sweden, and my birth father was old New England. Adoptive father was old New England family. Uh, so like crazy interwoven, right? And I lived in Canada for a while and followed that lineage and trying to trace it. And I ended up in Ojibwe country, of course, and started studying that part of the lineage and found relations, not living. Um, and interestingly enough, as I was doing that, I met Midiga on Genie.com, the genealogical site, because
Oh,
we had we had relationships. You know, many in his family are my cousins. I'm related to Little Shell 3. I'm related to Louis Riel. I'm related to, um, I can name them all, but it's every line that he has, I cross
Hmm.
in some fashion. And we have some common ancestors back, of course, in order to do that. So it was quite an undertaking for us to find each other. And that's one of the miracles that I see is how we would do that. Because neither one of us had a clue about each other, of course. I was searching. He was doing his lineages, which he knew. I didn't really know mine. And I was putting, pasting all this and cutting and pasting it all together. And he crops up. I said, well, this is interesting. Maybe I need to talk to this fella. And we started conversing through email. And then we realized our common grounds and our common ancestors. And he said to me, he said, I was hoping somebody from the Bouvier lines and the Cardinal lines would show up. And I go, well, here I am. It was strictly, it had to be a spiritual intervention because in this big wide world, how else would that happen? Why would I be researching lines that intersected with him and vice versa when we had no clue? It's those things that you can call them coincidences if that's what you want to do, but I see it as divine interventions that lead you. And as long as you keep following those leadings, or as I call them, inklings. I have an inkling about something. It's just a little kind of right there. And if I follow those, big things happen. And I teach that to my clients, because you want to poo-poo those inklings. Oh, that's just coincidence. So, I stumbled upon this. Well, maybe not. Maybe they're inklings. And if you're following them, I think that's spirit's way of whispering in our ear, go this way. Here's your path. And Mitika was doing that, and I was doing that, and the rest they say is history.
so you say your clients. What do you do for a living?
Well, a living, I use the term loosely. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, a diplomat in the American Society of experts in traumatic stress. And I specialize in dealing with trauma, intergenerational trauma, indigenous trauma, police and military trauma, and first responder and general trauma. My website is criticalincidentstress.com. Perhaps the best known things that I've been involved in this capacity was the Gulf oil spill, the Deepwater Horizon incident. It was my job to work with the families of the deceased, do the death notifications, and counsel the survivors for Transocean. That took 3 months because it went on for 3 months, right? From the time the blowout occurred until the time it was shut down. So most people understand that. I always work behind the scenes. This is kind of new to me, being up front, because I always flew under the radar in order to be able to do my job. I do counsel people. I've been a licensed counselor since 1978, a few years of experience. I do a lot of coaching as opposed to counseling, because I use a lot of my indigenous knowledge in my coaching practice, which is hard to do as a therapist because you have other rules and parameters. And I use a lot of spiritual teachings as a coach. And I'm also a ordained minister, non-sectarian. So I take care of people from cradle to grave, literally. And that's what I do in my day job.
So where did you learn the indigenous training to do this type of work?
Well, it's kind of one of those inkling things again. When I was in my early teens, my family moved to Niagara Falls, New York, for my father's job, Chemical Corporation. And we moved there at the time that the Niagara Power Project was in full steam. And what was happening is that the Tuscarora Reservation there in Niagara Falls was being eminent domained by the government so that they could use it for part of the power project. And Chief Elton Green became a friend of the family. He was a minister. My adoptive father was a lay minister, and he would often preach on the reserve when Chief Green couldn't be there because he was off in Washington and doing what he was doing, trying to get proper compensation for their land. It pretty much cut their reservation in half. And at the same time, there was a fellow there by the name of Wallace Mad Bear Anderson. Some of the old timers might be more familiar with him, but he was a big medicine and ex-Marine. And he did a lot of teaching and a lot of indigenous activity, like my first recollection is the Jay Treaty marches across the bridges from Niagara Falls and Lewiston over to Canada, because the Jay Treaty was being rescinded. The free movement between the indigenous in what's now called the United States and the indigenous in Canada, because they're families, but they were split by the border. And there was a big problem with that. And so my activity and my indigenous background was being fostered by being in the company of these two men. And it wasn't like they sat me down to teach me, but I was there amongst it as an observer and a learner. And it was there I learned a lot of my indigenous background as well as traditions, and started practicing. I was about 14. Okay. You have to remember at the time, there wasn't the reserve was right there. Our house was only a couple miles from the reserve, but the kids on the reserve weren't allowed to go to school with me. They had to go to the boarding school on the res. And I didn't understand it at the time. But I became knowledgeable about, you see, I didn't see them as any different than me. I was mixed blood. They were accepting. There was no question. Um, and it wasn't until I was older that I realized what that was about in terms of the boarding schools. And I was probably an older teenager when I realized the craziness of the boarding schools and the fact that they couldn't practice their religions. They had to, the reason my dad was on the reserve preaching in a Baptist church is because that was allowed, but it wasn't allowed for them to have any other kind of indigenous spiritual practice. And it wasn't until 1978 that, of course, all that was rescinded. So I was 28 years old before I had free access to my indigenous history and free practice.
So even though they were on the reservation, they were still prohibited from practicing their religion, even on the reservation.
Yes.
And the boarding school, you said the boarding school was also on the reservation also.
Yes, yes. I know some kids stayed there, but it was also a high school where some of them went home at night. I think it depended on their family situation. I'm not quite clear on that, but they didn't go to school where I went to school. They couldn't come off the res to go to school.
So were they typically going home on the weekend to be with their family, or they were just basically stripped away from their family while they were in their high school years and maybe go home during the summertime?
I don't think they were stripped away like they hadn't been sent away, but they were isolated there in that school. And if I wanted to talk to them or play with them or learn something, I had to go to them. They never came to town, so to speak, which is odd because the town I lived in, which was Lewiston, New York, had a very important history with the Tuscarora. Pretty much the Tuscarora saved the town. And now there's statues in the middle of the town celebrating what the Tuscarora did to save Lewiston, New York. And that's all history that you can read. But at the time that I lived there, all that was kept hidden. It was very rarely talked about, except for when I got to sit and listen to Chief Green and Wallace Mad Bear Anderson, because my dad would go to the res because of his relationship with Chief Green, and I basically tagged along. And just learned by osmosis. And then as things started to free up in my later teenage years, and they started having powwows again, and I was able to attend those and learn again more of the ceremony and spiritual practices that go along with powwows. They weren't dance contests then, you understand? It was a religious ceremony, a spiritual ceremony, and spiritual dancing that had all different shades of meaning. And so I was privy to learn all that. And to what end, I had no idea at the time, right? All I wanted to do was ride horses. I worked at a stud farm training racehorses when I was in high school. And to me, that was my vocation. And I still do that to this day, by the way. Still have racehorses. One of them you might know. He recently won the Preakness. His name is Seize the Gray. I own a piece of that one, which is one of the hairs on his tail, I believe. But it's still fun. It's still fun.
I don't think that most people, non-Indigenous people, understand the significance of dancing and that being a religious practice. Yes. I learned about it because I don't even remember the name of the book. There was a book that I listened to as an audiobook of a kid who was when he was around 8 years old, he was kidnapped by the Apache, and for the next 20 or 30 years, he lived among the Apache and other native tribes in the area. I don't know if he was in Utah or if he was in Arizona. And then later in his older years, he wrote a book, and he talked about when he was reintegrated back into, I'll call it white society,
Mhm.
um, that he went to church and he felt the spirit, and he got up and started dancing, and people were all upset at him because he's dancing in the church. They felt
Mhm.
that was sacrilegious, and to him, that was his way of expressing his love for God.
Mhm. Yeah. And I think it's a way of spirit moving us too. You look at even the powwow dancers today, I mean, even the contest dancers, every one of their movements have a meaning. They're not just up there flailing around. They're very orchestrated steps and choreographed very carefully and with spiritual meaning imbued in all of it. And it's the same way with Native American indigenous practices in general. Everything we do has a spiritual meaning imbued in it, is embedded as part of the practice. The other day, Mitika was teaching about the teepee and how the teepee is built and the spirituality of the teepee. Well, whoever thought of a teepee as being a spiritual building, you know, or that building a teepee was a spiritual um, endeavor. And even hunting buffalo. Hunting buffalo isn't about shooting buffalo. There is a whole practice around it, indigenously speaking. And I eat a lot of buffalo, but I want
That
to make sure that it was killed uh, in the good way, that
interesting.
it was
So
taken traditionally.
when I was actually just looking up the three poles teaching
Mhm.
that Chief Minigo was talking about: discipline, respect, and humility.
Those are the three
Three
first
poles.
poles.
What's that? That's the first three
I
poles.
said those are the first three.
Yes, and
There's 12
without
more.
discipline and respect and humility, the TP cannot stand.
Mhm.
And all the other 10 poles rest on these three teachings.
Yes.
Is there any more that you'd like to share about that?
Um, well, we kind of look at it that the three, the respect, um, that it speaks to our Jewish brothers and sisters, our LDS brothers and sisters, and of course all of our indigenous brothers and sisters are those three things. And that's why it's important that we all connect, because if we're going to build anything contrary to the world as we know it, it has to start with those three. And so we're looking spiritually for people that can agree and participate in such an endeavor. And that's why some of these teachings are coming out now, and even the scrolls, so that we can, nothing needs to be hidden anymore, because hidden things like secrets in a family fester. And it's time for us to share so that we can find what we have in common and build on that and build our teepee and the other 10 poles. And then there's some extra ones as well. Um,
So all the
I
other
think,
10 poles have a meaning too, right?
yes, very deep meanings. Yes.
Okay.
Leave it to Midiga Ogichida'a. That's his role, is to teach those things. My role is to guide him in how he teaches those, sort of to train him in the way that he should go.
We're grateful that Sherry Cardinal was willing to come on and talk to us. There's a lot more that took place in that interview, and that was just the first 20 minutes or so of it. And it's very interesting how family history work played a major role in Sherry Cardinal and David Taylor becoming close friends, and Sherry becoming a mentor to David Taylor as well. So, as it stands right now, the conference on September 20th and 21st in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, it is full. We don't have any more spots for people to sign up for. However, we are going to stream the event, and I'll go ahead and click this link right here, sign up for streaming. And the service is $20. And once you've signed up, you can create an account. And after you log in, you can then access the page for the streaming service. In that page currently, there are several of the interviews that have been done with David Taylor, Chief Mitigaw. There will be more that will be added of other people who will be participating in the conference. And on the day of the event, you'll be able to watch the event live. And after the event is complete, we will be able to bring the videos down and place them on that portal, and you can watch it and rewatch it as often as you want to. So thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you. If we can't see you live at the event in Fond du Lac, then please sign up for the streaming service. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.